Expand your mind, don't let it wither and die. You'll find that it lifts your spirits high to the sky. So meditate.
Thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Oh, Matthew, it's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so I really wanted to chat with you in particular. I think, you're involved obviously in some CBD, which we'll talk about a little bit. But, the other thing that really kind of got me that I identify a lot with work schedules and just the way that, our society is always on the go, it seems. Your story's pretty interesting to me because it really combines CBD, which, I work in the cannabis industry, so there's some correlation there, but also from just the aspect of what kind of led you to that path, and I would love for you to maybe tell a little bit about that. My understanding is that, work became a bit of a stress issue, and burnout became a bit of an issue. And I think this is something that a lot of professionals really struggle with in general. And even before, and correct me if I'm wrong, but even before you got to the CBD, there were three other things that kind of influenced you, and that was diet, exercise, and the outdoors, which I'm a big advocate of all three of those. So kind of set the stage a little bit and tell me a little bit about your background, what was kind of leading up to that stress and burnout, and that so-called sort of moment of clarity that you were just like, I've got to make some sort of change.
Happy to, Matthew. And I think you put it very diplomatically that work became, sort of took over. And in many respects it did. I think, for me, the journey was one fueled by a drive to achieve, and in many respects, I'm a product of the 80s. Work and achievement very much became sort of the defining characteristic of my life, starting even in high school and then certainly into college. And it then led to a legal career in which I saw it as a sort of fast track to have the status and financial rewards that came along with that profession. And while very rewarding, and I'm so grateful for so much that I learned and acquired in the way of skill and experience through my legal career, it led me to a very, very dark place. That low moment that you referred to is a very defining one in my life because, I as you tipped off and recapped in my intro, I started as a government prosecutor, as a lawyer, but then moved into private practice and ultimately into a corporate legal position in a Fortune 500 that became wrapped up in the Enron and Arthur Andersen set of legal cases that went on for years. And it was out of that experience that just an opportunity surfaced for me to found a tech and consulting firm focused on a specific area of law, which is discovery, right? Where parties exchange information. And when the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Department of Justice, even worse, they come knocking, you need to deliver. And so high stakes. And I found myself in this world focused in this area of electronic data in particular. And while there was an immense opportunity with creating this business, it also perpetuated this workaholism. That's really what it was. And an addiction, if you will, to achieving more and more. That really took a toll seriously on my health, on my family. And, I had a great reckoning. And that reckoning happened November 3rd, 2012, on the floor of a luxurious hotel bathroom at the Broadmoor Resort in Colorado Springs. A resort really founded by the Rockefellers and the JP Morgans way back in the day when they would literally get their cars out on trains out to this beautiful resort in Colorado Springs at the foot of Pikes Peak. And that moment for me was one in which I knew waking up at 5 a.m. that something had seriously gone awry. I was 42 years old, the founder and CEO of this multi-million-dollar business that served some of the biggest companies in the country. And it was at that point I knew that the business was in jeopardy. So much of my life at that time, had 3 young children. My marriage was in jeopardy if I didn't turn things around in a big way. And I would say as much a combination of grit and more so even grace came into play. And I started that moment to have a completely different perspective on this drive toward achievement that had fueled so much of my life professionally. And it led me to turn over every stone to figure out a better way to manage my stress, anxiety. I had periods of depression. I was diagnosed clinically depressed, prescribed antidepressant, a mild one, Zoloft, but nonetheless, it was something that I was on for years and I couldn't get off of. And so, this little moment was a turning point, a very significant one. It led to the 3 things that you touch on that, in my mind, very much made all the difference in turning things around. And then years later, founding PurePower Botanicals.
Did you have a plan when you had this moment of clarity? Was it, like, I'm going to start with, investigate, figuring out like what's the first step and what was that first step? Was it, obviously nutrition plays a big part in, it's the fuel for our bodies. It plays a big part in how we feel and how we function in daily life. So does exercise. Was it a combination of the two, or did you start kind of slow and kind of just expand as you learned more?
Yeah, great question. It was sort of multidimensional in a way, because the first thing that happened was, really the lowest moment of my life at that point, right? And I had so much self-loathing because the long and short of it is I just went on a bender, and it led to me, waking up on the floor of this bathroom at 5 a.m. And just a self-acceptance. Like completely accepting myself, even in a moment when I wanted to do the exact opposite and continued to, loathe what I'd become. And that was really the turning point. And that was the first thing that came to me, was just this self-acceptance. And on the heels of that, this just gratitude I had never experienced. It was so all encompassing. And it was a gratitude for just life, for whatever force had beat my heart through the night and had me wake up alive. I don't know why that came over to me, but it did. And then this compulsion to serve as best I possibly could. So much was weighing on me about the business. Would we scale? Would we succeed? Would we fail? Right? There's just the roller coaster of entrepreneurship, particularly as you get into the, you start to, have some success. And I just sort of let all of that go and just committed to serve. But I knew in order to do so, I needed to show up much better, right? And that started with just my attention and my focus, and that all of a sudden now became one of service as best I possibly could for my family, for my team, for the clients that trusted us, and also just my resilience, right? I was worn down. I was propped up by caffeine all day long. Buffered by antidepressants, and then using alcohol to calm down at night. And I knew I had to reset all of that. So yes, I did immediately say, I've got to figure out a better way to manage stress and anxiety, to have much better energy through the course of the day. And the thing that I turned to, Matthew, was, okay, well, nutrition. I can look at nutrition. I can take exercise more seriously and make it a non-negotiable. And that's what I did. I started to make things non-negotiable. I started to, sort of overhaul my nutrition, my diet, and I went more plant-based, inspired very much by some articles and then books that I read, one of which, Rich Roll's book, Finding Ultra, was very impactful for me in early 2013. I heard him on a podcast, and I thought, here's a lawyer who kind of experienced some of what I did in the way of a reckoning, right? And so I started to overhaul my diet, and the movement part of it was, I had to get moving and do so consistently a few times a week. And so, I turned to, I lived in the mountains and still do in Colorado. And so there are trails right outside my door. So mountain biking. And then I read an article about this ultra endurance trail running. And this is in late 2012, 2013. And then I read the book Born to Run by Christopher McDougall that very much talks about long distance running and how it's part of our DNA. And that then led me into, I liked hiking. And if I could run on trails and do so in a sort of different way, a more minimalist way, boy, after just a few runs of out on the trail, I was really hooked. And that led me then to really jump into ultra endurance trail running in a very big way. That then led to supplementation. I started to look at ways that I could enhance my energy and my recovery. And I discovered cannabis and other super herbs like ashwagandha and turmeric. Because as I started to dig into this more, I learned what others were using, and Rich in his book, Finding Ultra, talked about cordyceps. And all of a sudden I was turned on to functional mushrooms, and one thing led to another. And the cannabis element was one that I was totally foreign to me, because I grew up kind of, large Irish Catholic family, very traditional. So for me, cannabis, marijuana was like the next step to heroin. So I was really against it early on. Right. But I read an article in the Denver Post in early 2013. I'll never forget. I had the paper with me. I almost fell off my chair when I read this article about this plant called hemp that reportedly had these therapeutic and beneficial attributes to it that addressed anxiety and stress, and that it was non-psychoactive and legal. And what shocked me so much is I started my legal career as an assistant DA prosecuting cannabis crimes. No one told me anything about hemp that was non-psychoactive and legal. So that really turned me on, and I thought, I've got to investigate this. And so, I talked to the doctor that was prescribing me the antidepressants. She, expectedly, not surprisingly, she really couldn't help me. So I was left to my own devices to just dig into more research and start to self-experiment. And in so doing, I started to combine hemp extract, now known as CBD, with these other super herbs. And all of a sudden, I started to see these gains in terms of just my ability to run much longer distances at high altitude, coupled with my team sharing with me that I was much more calm. I was much more focused. And I noticed too, like I was sleeping more deeply. Alcohol started to have a really adverse effect on me. Like I just naturally was like, that doesn't make me feel good, because I started to feel so much better. I think in part because I was cleaning up my diet. I was supplementing with hemp extract and these other super herbs. And all of a sudden alcohol diminished the good that I was feeling day to day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, alcohol's, it's very counterproductive to anybody who's trying to be an active, lifestyle in general. I think it's one of the first things to cut out, which is, if you're going to start revamping, a lifestyle change. And it's so strange that it's so readily accessible, so much advertised, it's so accepted by society. And look, I like to have a drink now and then when I'm out socializing as well, but there's a very big distinction. And at some point, probably in your 20s for most people, that you wake up one morning and you're like, this is just not helping me be productive when it comes to what you're putting into your body. What kind of changes, kind of going back to the diet there for just a second, like what were some of the changes that you made besides obviously, cutting out maybe the alcohol? What were you eating prior versus what changes did you make? And obviously you said you went to more of a vegan kind of diet, but what were you eating before, just in general?
Yeah, standard American diet in many respects, and at times, like Rich Roll has talked about, sort of the drive-through, working late and just sort of eating anything and everything without much attention to what I was putting in.
Convenience.
And in hindsight, I see that I was very much on the standard American diet, and it was more carb heavy. Dairy was a big component, and the result was, I can see it now only in hindsight, that my body was not fat adapted in the sense that it was, fueled by carbs that are glucose, and when that runs out, I needed to eat again. Right. Because my body wasn't adapted to burning fat. Yeah. So I'd crash. So my family would see it, my team, like, hey, dude, have you eaten? Because I was on that roller coaster, right? Where if your body's just adapted to carbs and glucose as a form of fuel, when that runs out, guess what you got to do? You got to eat again. And I think through the long distance running and then the changes in diet, I became more fat adapted, where my body started to learn how to gain fuel through burning fat as opposed to short-term carb, right? And so one of the things, in addition to Rich's book, Scott Jurek's book, Eat, Run, I read that book. Also, in the back of my mind, I had been an early consumer of podcasts, and Tim Ferriss in particular.
Of course.
And Tim had done this experiment 2007, 2008, which I'd remembered about, where he tested different dietary approaches, right? Paleo, keto, he had a number, and he put it out to his audience. And I remember him talking about how what he termed this sort of slow carb approach had yielded the greatest results, not so much in terms of massive weight gain, but the percentage of people that stuck with it. And in sticking with it, they had the best results over a longer period of time. So I started to experiment with that slow carb, okay, eat the same thing pretty consistently, right? And all of a sudden, I feel like, my whole biochemistry started to change physiologically. I became more fat adapted because I stuck to a very simple diet that only had, limited variability. And also I took seriously, which I think was one of the things that Tim pointed to, that he thought made such a difference in the success of the slow carb approach, was the cheat day, right? And many will argue, you shouldn't do cheat days.
You have to.
Yeah, I have to. And it worked for me. I was like, oh, great. I can restrict myself 6 days a week. If I know my day was Saturday, if I know on Saturday, I am going to just dive into everything that I've been restricting myself to during the course of the week.
Yeah.
And it was a relief valve. And I think that's what Tim found it to be, a psychological relief valve, that you can restrict yourself if you know one day you're going to, pile up on all the things that you're restricting from. What happened to me, and I think has happened to so many others, is, for the first 2 or 3 months of that, it was great. I love pigging out on a Saturday. But after a period of time, Saturday would start to approach, and it wasn't me exercising willpower. It was my body starting to have a visceral reaction to the thought that I was going to eat a pint of ice cream and just pig out and everything. Because then Sunday, Monday, I just felt shitty.
Terrible.
I felt wrecked. Yeah. So that was a big element, and it just kind of got me on my way. And then as I got into that ultra endurance world and my mileages started to go up to 50-mile distance, then I was really priming my nutrition for optimal fuel for energy and long-term endurance, not in a fanatical way, but just in a very almost, again, visceral way. Like, is this going to fuel me in the way that I know I want to show up or not? And then I started to make decisions on that basis.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting, things, developments. As you said, Tim Ferriss did, the experiment, I guess you could call it, that he did several years ago. And, even today, like I myself have experimented, because I grew up in the South, and, the typical biscuits and gravy and, the whole nine. And, as I got older, I knew that, most people when I was in high school, I felt like by the time they hit 30 or 40, they were kind of done physically. And I just knew I didn't want that to be me. And so I really just tried to educate myself a lot on it. And I've tried a lot of different diets. And I think you hit something that's very important there. A lot of these diets will work. It's whether or not you could, and I don't even like to call them diets because it's a strategy for eating, for nutrition, a nutrition strategy, but they're hard to maintain, a lot of them. And I think that's where most people, they'll have success, but then they fall off the wagon. And I think, like you said, that cheat day is really important at first. And it's funny that you also hit on something that I really identify with, is that the human body is so malleable and adaptable. And if you feed it fast food and sugar, it's going to crave fast food and sugar. And as you transition off of that, you're still going to crave those things. But as you start to transition, the longer you're off of those things, the less you crave them. And then the body actually will start to crave the lean meats or the salad or, whatever that healthy option is. Your body will actually start to crave it. And somebody who I think is a really interesting example of this, even though I think sometimes he does include some sweets, is The Rock. He's kind of famous for his cheat day. And a lot of times, he will have some sweets there, and I guess he can get away with it. But, he's also, eats a lot of sushi. There's also healthy elements to his cheat day as well in some respects. But I think people have to have that reward factor until their body kicks in and goes into autopilot on it. And, having the discipline to instill that, I think is really important. And I really, you mentioned Tim Ferriss, two other people that I really kind of look to for like discipline motivation is like Jocko Willink and David Goggins. Both of them always make me feel like anytime I feel like I'm slacking off on whether it's diet or exercise or whatever, I'm like, I know those guys are both older than me and have had more knee problems. Goggins for sure has had knee problems. I'm like, I need to get my butt out there and do this,
Yeah. The freedom of discipline in many respects, I admire them for that same approach. And it is a significant shift, I feel like, from getting out of, thinking about diet from an analytical, intellectual perspective to just getting to the point where intuitively your body's signaling what it wants. And you're exactly right. Once you clean up the gut, right, it'll want more of whatever you've been feeding it that's cleaning up the gut, right? And I'm certain that my episodes of depression were certainly tied to my gut was all out of whack, and through the vagus nerve, right? It's directly connected to the brain.
Yeah.
And once I started to clear that up, I felt more clear here, right? And then it becomes more of intuitive eating as opposed to strict regimented. Now, of course, if you're training for major events and it serves you to measure out and be precise, great. But I'm just talking day to day. And to your point, like, what's sustainable, right? I think, athletes often, it's not sustainable. Like, you can do it for a while, but like that regimented, fanatical weighing of everything, it's just, that's tough to sustain. I've done a little bit of that. And I think that, I look at it so much of the 80-20 rule. I mean, you talk about The Rock. I feel very much the same. When I'm with my kids or we go to restaurants, I'm not restricting, right? Because, I can't have that, right? I know that 80% of the time matters, not the 20% when I want to have chocolate cake or something like that. I will say, though, it's a slippery slope, because the cleaner, right? The cleaner I've gotten, if I even reach for a chocolate bar that I used to love or something else, right? I literally, and this is drawn out science, right? Of course, this sounds a bunch of woo-woo that, you reach for something, you'd have a negative reaction. But, muscle testing shows that the body picks up signals even before you ingest something. And that's been my experience more recently. Like, if I reach for something, my body has a reaction, right? David Hawkins, Power versus Force. So much of the science behind muscle testing is the body has its own intelligence, and as you get more clean in terms of how you're eating, the body just sends signals. And if you listen, right, that's hard at times. Like, no, I want that beer. I want this, right? But if you listen, I think the body can guide us with its own wisdom.
Yeah, there's often times, where I've had, whether it's a healthy food or unhealthy food, and I'll go to consider, considering buying it or getting this item, and I can literally taste it in my mouth. And it's like, I'll know whether or not, based on, how that reaction is when I'm tasting it, even though I'm not eating it, I'll know, whether I should, get that or whether I should pass on it, Very interesting. You've talked a lot about running and getting into that. What was kind of like your transition into the physical aspect of your diet was kind of getting in line. What was kind of the transition into the physical aspect? Was it strictly running or was there an aspect of resistance training and things like that in it as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I grew up an athlete, played competitive ice hockey and tennis and, a variety of different sports growing up. But then, through my legal career, just a lot of that fell by the wayside. And, what I discovered in the way of just more sort of higher intensity, first mountain biking and then the trail running. It was a different experience of athletics in the sense that it was less about competition and more about my own sort of self-discovery, right? And recovery in many respects. And it's one of the most significant things I fell in love with the ultra community was that it was less about looking at your watch and measuring every output and instead just being in the experience and getting through it. Right. Because ultra is just that. It's like getting through it right now. Obviously, there are elite runners that move across the ground at speeds that just dumbfound me. But for so many, most right. It's just the experience. And so for me, the athletics and the outdoor, it became as much about moving my body as it did connecting with myself in a deeper and deeper and deeper way. And I think ultra trail running in particular really it provides great conditions for that. Why? Because first of all, the distances, if you're not connected with yourself and managing your heart rate and your breath, you run the risk you're just going to blow up. And that's very awkward when you're 20 miles out into the wilderness and where are you going to go? Right. There's no road to pull up. There's nothing. Right. So being very mindful of breath and energy management is so key in that world. And I really fell in love with that. So that's one dimension, like falling in love with just the connection with self. And then the other was just wilderness and being exposed to nature in a way that I gravitated toward as when I was younger. And I think it definitely drove me to go to University of Vermont. And I've always been drawn to wilderness, but now being out on the trails for an hour, 2 hours at a time. And then during events, 8 hours, 10 hours, right? At the 100-mile distance, 36 hours, which is extreme. I get that. But it's been an excuse, honestly, to just expose myself to wilderness in a way that has so many other positive benefits that I think we need more than we ever do. Because, I would go from being on my phone up until the moment I get to the trailhead and I leave my phone in the car, right? That's a big, right? For so many of us, we're constantly connected to our device and to technology. And it was just such an offset and a balance for me. And then an enrichment to my life that allowed me to weather the storms connected to my device and everything along with it so much better.
Yeah. No, it's I can very much relate to this. I grew up myself playing a lot of sports, was an athlete, but as you get older, obviously work does kind of play a factor. But I also think that a lot of those team sports you grow up playing are very difficult to maintain as an adult. You're not around your friends 8 hours, 9 hours a day to be able to do those activities. So, even myself, I have transitioned a lot to more individualistic sports. Running has become one. And I myself transitioned to trail running because for a couple reasons. One is I find that the trail running is so much easier on my joints in general, my hips, my knees, my ankles, my back. There's just like that little extra give that the asphalt concrete doesn't have. Makes all the difference for some reason. And the other aspect of it, I think you touched on there really well, is just the nature aspect of it. There's something about being out in nature that's rejuvenating. I think, for me, I really enjoy, smoking a little bit before the run. I think it really dials you in. And, I also find it a little easier as I'm running, especially in nature, to kind of put yourself into like a crazy, imagine myself in a crazy survival situation or something where it really can kind of just make the run more fun and more engaging and more, appealing to you, and maybe more intense as well. But I think, the trail running has been something that I think is very therapeutic. And I think not just getting out in nature, I think people would definitely benefit by being out in nature more, because even when I was in the middle of LA, I would have to get out of the city and just go to the mountains, go for a hike, take a day off and just unplug, like you said, get away from the phone and everything. There's something very rejuvenating about it. And I would even say that, it's actually getting back to like what is ingrained in our DNA to some extent. Like, I don't think we're, as humans, designed necessarily to spend 8 or 10 hours a day in front of a computer like this. I think we're supposed to be active. We're supposed to be in the sunshine. We're supposed to be moving our bodies. Like you said, just get moving. It's something that a lot of, it's something our country, I will say, kind of, I feel like struggles with a bit. I spent a couple years overseas, and two things that I noticed very significantly about their culture versus our culture here is, one, they don't have fast food everywhere, which you touched on, and two, they're just more active. They go out and they're in the parks, they're active, they're playing sports, they're just outdoors more than I feel like Americans are in general. And I think people really miss out on something when it comes to both connecting with nature as well as the mental clarity. And I almost look at exercise, whether it's running or whether it's a really hard weight training session, whatever it is that you enjoy doing, it's almost therapeutic. It's almost a mental, I've always joked that it's way cheaper than having a therapist, because it really just makes everything else seem very much easier to handle after you've done maybe a really intense hot yoga session, or you've done, 8 or 9 miles in the heat of the day or whatever. Everything else just seems to be so much easier to handle. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, think about, the deluge of information that we're bombarded with on a daily basis that takes us out of ourselves, right? It's all these external data points. And that's dangerous, because then our own foundation is jeopardized in a way, right? Because we're constantly externally oriented. Right. And reconnecting with self, I think, is so critically important. And nature has just a way of doing that, right? Where I love the way you describe that. For me, I would envision like piercing this bubble, where I'm leaving the trailhead and I'm piercing a bubble, and I'm going into a world that is foreign to me and most of us day to day, that exists independent of us. And it's just an opportunity to regain perspective, right, in so many ways. And I think that's why, particularly in certain cultures where, they have perhaps a little bit more wisdom around holistic health, where things like forest bathing in South Korea or Japan are taken seriously as a form of prescribed health and deal with conditions around anxiety and depression. And I think we can all benefit so much, right? I feel like it's one of the most significant antidotes to all the woes that come along with, what is, I think, clearly an addiction to technology and how destructive it can be if not checked by some counterbalancing force that reconnects us with our true selves.
Well, and it's tough to do too. There's a lot of, I think we've had good times over the last few decades, and I don't want to be critical, but it sort of feels like we've maybe gotten a little soft as well. And, I as much as we want to have certain things maybe that are ingrained in our culture and our society, it's one of the things that I feel like there's a bit of even a pushback against it. Like, being too healthy is almost a negative. There's, look, I don't want to body fat shame anybody because, everybody's different. Everybody has their own struggles, their own situations. At the same time, it's difficult for me to quite understand how some people make the argument, that somebody that's very, very obviously obese, and claim that they are just as healthy as someone who is not. Live your life. If you're happy, but let's keep science, let's keep it real with what's going on as well.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and science shows, what contributes to health and what takes away from it when you look objectively. Right. I think that, you're right. I think the push, particularly for us in this culture, has been so much around convenience and comfort and luxury and all the things that, I think we're raised with. Certainly as a child of the 80s, growing up as a teenager, that was very much the drive. And it has this, dark side, which is, we're disconnected from ourselves in a way and our innate capacities because we're in a climate controlled environment. We drive around in vehicles and we that's what the promise, right, of Madison Avenue and so many advertising is comfort and convenience. And that is a very slippery slope. And I think it leads to a lot of the social ills and certainly health care ills that we are struggling with in this country when you look really under the hood, whether it's, mass inflammation, which is essentially the same thing as obesity, right? And what's causing that, coupled with just mental health. We know that we're struggling in so many ways, particularly young adults, and we need to do something different. So certainly nutrition and movement outside, in my experience, are two fundamental ways of doing that.
Yeah, it was, the whole, and I don't want to get, down the rabbit hole, but even over the last couple years, I felt like it was a bit of a missed opportunity to really drive those messages home. Those elderly and overweight were the two most affected groups. And I think that's going to be true for any disease or virus that we encounter. It seems like an easy fix. Yeah.
And from my experience, and this is my sort of cynical lawyer, having been inside the boardrooms of some very big companies and dealing with regulators in Washington, I think that we really do have to look out for our own. To think that the government is looking out for our best interests is very foolhardy. And I think, the loss of 400,000 or 500,000 American lives to the opioid crisis is proof positive that we do really need to use our own independent judgment and not rely on just what we're recommended, when so many of those things, we can see have led to a loss of life on a grand scale.
Yeah. Before we get into cannabis, CBD, and that, one more about the running. So did you just decide I wanted to start doing ultras, and you just started jumping in doing 20 miles at a clip, or did you build up to this? Because I love to run, but I really find that about 10, maybe 12 miles is about really my comfort zone limit. I can't imagine. I love the thought of an ultra and doing 100 miles, grueling, just punishing myself, the mental challenge of it. I love the whole idea of it, but I sit and I think, man, how do I feel after 12 miles? Could I really even do that?
It's a great question. And it did start very slow for me. I read a magazine article about, 100-mile ultra endurance trail runs that were happening. And I remember distinctly when I read it, like, that's insane. Oh my God, that would be something I could never, ever conceive myself doing. But, as I read Born to Run, and I started to dig into this minimalist approach and how we run naturally as humans. And I think you can see it with certain runners around the world, that are closer to their indigenous roots, right? Whether it's East Africa or Mexico, it's a forward run, right? It's
yes.
The chest is out forward. The feet are a little bit further back, not unlike, honestly, if you look at ostriches or chickens, that's the way they're running. They're more forward, right? And what results is less of when you're heel striking and you're out in front with your heels, that pressure, right? And that trauma in a way goes up through the body and it creates exhaustion. And so as I started to experiment with this minimalist style, the first thing I did was I as wacky as it is, I had a pair of North Face river sandals that were covered, right? It was more of a shoe, but it was, literally a piece of just, rubber. And I started to run in those in the earliest days. And I only ran for, 30 minutes, right, at most. And even then I had to walk some. And then I experimented a little bit with barefoot running. But what I realized was listening while I was running. And what do I mean by that? Where is it hurting? Where do I need to back off? When do I need to walk? Because if I don't, the effort's just going to be a lot shorter. I'm going to be worn out and I got to head back to the car, right? So I think just that sort of trial and error, but listening to the body, and that even has shown up in the long ultras. That to me is it's a critical component of success in the ultra. You have to just listen more closely to the body and what's going on, because if you don't, you're going to blow up. And so, for me, it was the 30 minutes, and then 45, and then an hour. And then also, I think in part because I was in the mountains, I took seriously walking. So when I was just gassed, I would just walk and dial it back. And then when I felt strong again, then I would go again. So a lot of that, and that's certainly, in a 100-mile ultra, there's as much walking, if not more walking, than there is running, particularly in the mountains, right? Because it's not realistic for most, mortals, right? There are those incredible individuals. But for me, it was very much about listening to my body, dialing back, and then just, okay, I can go again. I can go again. And I think that's really been a cause for me to have, enjoyable ultras. While certainly at the end of it, I look down at my feet and think, oh my God, they're screaming at me like, what have you done to us? It's that comes along with it. But to even get to that finish line, I think is so much about listening and adjusting along the way.
Interesting. Yeah, I myself went through the whole progression. I started when I started running many years ago now, in traditional Nike Pegasus, I think was running shoes was my first shoe. And then steadily, I did the reading and same thing. I have slowly over the years, I transitioned down to, I think, a 0.4 drop, and then from the 8 to the 4. And then, now I've been in a flat minimalist shoe for quite some time. What kind of shoe do you prefer? Do you have a brand or a model that you really favor?
Yeah, great question. And I took from Christopher McDougall's book, Born to Run, that so much of running on trails, particularly, it's off camber. There's rocks, there's roots, and right. And it really dawned on me that I'd been running, the wrong way. First of all, with more of a heel strike, right? The aggressive sort of fast pace running with your heels. On the one hand. And then the second is, I was running in sneakers that were doing this to my toes. Right. And it just makes no sense when you're on a trail, when you want your toes with their strength and their ability to help balance to be able to do that. And so I immediately went to a wider toe box so that my toes could actually feel the ground, which sounds kind of funny, right? Because you're running, the last thing you're thinking is, how are my toes impacting the ground? But it made a difference. I could just tell. And the reason I could tell is because I experimented. like I went back to more of a traditional running shoe, and not the first run, but about the third run, I started to notice, oh, I got this funny knee pain. Oh, this other pain showing up on my ankle. So I just said, nope, I'm done with the traditional running shoe that puts my toes like this, and I'm sticking with a shoe that's going to allow my toes to, outreach. So really my preferred is Ultra. I've been in Hoka's, I've been in Adidas. Each have their own benefits. I haven't been in Brooks yet. I'd like to give them a try. But, for me, the most important thing is wide toe box, minimalist, so that I can really stay midsole to forefoot. Midsole to forefoot. That's how I want to be running.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. My running shoe of choice right now is an Ultra as well. I do admit I like a little bit tighter of a shoe when I'm doing like explosive training in the gym or something, jumps, lunges, those sorts of things. But you're absolutely right. And I don't think unless you've ran on a trail in particular in a wide-toed shoe like an Ultra, I don't think you understand that your toes are so limited, because as I have ran in the Ultras, I've went through, I think I'm on my third pair now. I've actually noticed that my toes splay more. They have naturally, even when I'm walking around barefoot, they have more space in between the toes. And it makes you realize, like, really you're misshaping, you're malforming your foot over the course of your life in most traditional shoes. Not just your toes, but also with the zero drop, I think you get more, I think there's more range of motion in your I guess it's maybe your Achilles, your soleus, whatever it is that kind of runs up from your heel of your foot to the back of your knee there. You definitely have a wider range of motion and mobility with a flatter shoe, because that elevated shoe in the traditional one it just cuts that off and forces you almost to do the heel strike.
Yeah. And I think for so many people that get into their 40s and 50s, they haven't experimented with that. So they're just left with, oh, running's not for me anymore. Nope. Knees are done. Right. Ankles are done. Well, of course they are, because I know that. That's the way I was. And I felt like running was too much for me. I hated running.
Yeah.
But as I experimented, there's a way we can do it in a way that works more with the way the body has been for eons biomechanically, right? To serve us, and toes and the range of motion, as you put it, with the foot is a key component.
Yeah. I've become a real big fan. I recently, just a few months ago, I actually tore my calf muscle doing Muay Thai, but I've been recovering. As I've been recovering, I've become a bit of a fan of this guy. I think his name's Ben Patrick. He's on Instagram under knees over toes. He's got a lot of really interesting training methods that go against, growing up, I was always told, whatever you do, the knee never goes over the toe. The knee, you always got to be able to see your toes in front of the knee. And, what you're realizing and what he kind of preaches is that, do less weight. Don't try to do as much weight, but do the full range of motion. Take the knee over the toe. It's the same reason why people get a certain age, they can't do if you know what a yoga squat sort of is, where you're kind of squatting down and you're really butts almost to the ground. You just lose that range of motion. So I definitely think there's something to that. And for me, as I've gotten older, you kind of touched on it earlier. Recovery has been a big factor. I wish I had known more about proper stretching, proper foam rolling. It's such a huge factor. But also is the supplementation, which is really kind of leading into to the hemp and the CBD. I obviously I supplement with some other things as well. I've used definitely mushrooms for different things for performance. On it actually has a really good Shroom Tech product that I find is actually quite good. I can notice a difference actually using that in my endurance and my workouts. I think there's some interesting things to that. Tell me a little bit more about your journey learning about these wide, for our culture, widely unknown, supplements that can really kind of aid that healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think widely unknown. Many of them, out of Asian cultures, but also, indigenous cultures, even here, right?
Right
White
here,
willow bark
yeah.
is an example, right? Native people lived on the land. And therefore they had to know what could help them, right? What did they do before the ER, right? They discovered over millennia which plants would be most helpful for certain conditions, whether it was gastrointestinal, whether it was surface cuts or the like. For me, it was really trial and error in many respects. But my mom in the early '80s, she got turned on to the Vitamin Bible, and I'm one of 7, and I think in part she just didn't want to take us to the doctor every time we had something, and so she started to experiment with some of those things. So that planted the seed early on. And then when I had this moment in 2013, when I read this article about cannabis and hemp in particular, right? Because cannabis is the genus, that's the plant, just like tomatoes. There's varieties of tomatoes, right? Cannabis is the plant, and there's what's commonly referred to as marijuana that's high in THC that has a psychoactive effect. And then there's hemp, which has been grown for rope and textiles and paper and so much for eons, right? And it was just, digging into things that I started to hear about, like cordyceps and other functional mushrooms, like ashwagandha, and then looking into traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, which is sort of the nutritional element of yoga, right? That's existed in India forever. It was from there that I started to just experiment with these things. And in the midst of me doing so, and sort of back to my former business, I was in the midst of the business really started to take off after I had this big reckoning, and I started to make changes. And around this time, my cousin, who's my co-founder at PurePower, Sean McCabe, he sustained a traumatic brain injury that put him in the ICU. They didn't know if he was going to make it. He did, and he went into rehab, and he was a highly accomplished executive in the wind industry, gotten an MBA from University of Michigan, and he was rendered, back to basics, right? Learning how to ride a bike again, right? Couldn't even do that. And about 4 months in his recovery, I said to him, I've been doing more research and discovering the anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective properties of hemp extract and other herbs. And so I started to suggest them to him. And over the course of weeks and months, he felt like his recovery started to accelerate. And those things were much better than what he was being prescribed. And that sort of fueled a discussion between us. And as I sold that last business, I was in the midst of that sale and transition. I told Sean that I didn't find any other products out on the market, not a one that I could find that combined these various super herbs with hemp extract. And my sense was that the hemp was doing something. And now I've since discovered and wrote a book, Plants' Performance in the Endocannabinoid System, 21st Century Sports Medicine. And that book is really the result of that research, of digging into the medical studies and also anecdotal information from former NFL players and others about what cannabinoids were doing to them. And then when combining with other super herbs, it seemed like a 1 + 1 = 3, premised on this sense that if the cannabinoids were nourishing the cells in this endocannabinoid system in ways that enhanced cell-to-cell communication, and science shows this, that's what cannabinoids do, right? In addition to support mitochondrial function and energy production, they enhance cell-to-cell communication. Well, if the cells are communicating better and you make available other herbs at the same time that nourish certain aspects inside, certain functions inside the body, all of a sudden, hemp and the cannabinoids can be sort of a Trojan horse to deepen the impacts of these other herbs that are introduced at the same time. and there were no products out there. So that was really the genesis behind PurePower in 2017. It took us a year and a half to find the right herbalist to come up with the blends, and then manufacturing. Right at the time, no one was taking hemp oil and reducing it to powder to combine into capsules. So it took us quite a while, but we launched at the end of 2018. And we seeded the products with some pro athletes. We had some beta testers, and the pro athletes came back, some of them in their early to mid 30s, and they had new personal records to report. And so we knew something really significant had happened in these combinations. And that led to a coverage in Runner's World, their first article about CBD, which was a big deal for Runner's World at the end of 2018. I was republished in Bicycling, and we've gotten other mentions in Ski Magazine and the like. And I think it's the combination, right? We're not a CBD company. We're a super company that supports the fundamentals of health and well-being that underlie athletic performance at a high level. And that's really been our core focus, Matthew, from the get-go.
Yeah, no, I like that. And tell me, is this something, because it does seem to have, from what you're saying, a dramatic impact on, performance, athletic performance. Is this something that you take just as a daily supplement, or is it something you take around your performance, whatever it is your activity might be?
A little of both. Definitely intended for regular use because these are adaptogens, right? And adaptogens work much different than Advil, something designed in a lab that's meant to work in 2 hours, right? Adaptogens, they accrue. Their benefits accrue over time, but also the body adapts. And so we recommend our customers, they cycle off the products, right? We're one of the companies that says, stop taking our products. And the reason we say that is to let the body to assimilate everything you've taken over a 30-day period and give the body 5 to 7 days to reset, right? So intermix periods of cycling off is really what we recommend. And then when you're coming up to events, certainly doubling down, being ready for a big effort. Our Power Up Energy product, right? We definitely recommend building up. And then the Reboot Recovery product, same thing, right? Doubling the dose, which you can do safely, right? Around times of high intensity, if that makes sense. And sleep is another key element to what we call our PurePower system. It's one that pro athletes, you think energy, the anti-inflammatory, the recovery. No, so many of these high-performing athletes, pro athletes, sleep. And so our Power Down product is an essential one because that's so much of where recovery happens.
Yeah, I mean, that's besides our diet, lack of exercise. I think sleep is the third factor there that most Americans probably don't take serious enough. I know for me, I can operate pretty well around, 5.5, 6 hours if I need to, but over a prolonged period of time, or if I have a long session where, I don't get sleep, maybe only a couple hours or something, it's the first thing I can tell when I'm going to get sick. If I'll just double down on the sleep one night, it makes most of the time, that's how I feel like I avoid getting sick, is just taking that extra rest. And like you said, it's so important for recovery and most of us just don't give ourselves a good night's sleep here.
Yeah. And, it's exacerbated by, the pace at which we go, the volume of information we're exposed to, the light that we're exposed to late in the day. I think we know all these things, but it's part and parcel of just this low grade, sort of persistent anxiety and fight or flight that most of us are in just by the nature of modern life. And it's very difficult, right, to unwind and then get into deeper slates of sleep. And that's where I think Mother Nature can help in a very, very big way.
Yeah, very true. So when it comes to the CBD aspect of your product, is it obviously it's derived from hemp? Is it full spectrum, or is
it's only full spectrum? It'll only be ever full spectrum
That's
for
awesome.
us. There's obviously been a push for CBD only isolates and now splitting off CBN and CBG. And I realize there's benefits of doing so for targeted uses, but I think the risk you run there is that the sum is greater than the parts. And when you start parsing it out, you lose what's known as the entourage effect, which it refers to that synergistic impact that these things feed one another. And that's the way nature intended it, right? For whatever reason, they interact with our body more powerfully, synergistically than pieces parts. And so, yeah, it's just full spectrum. And I think that, for us, it's critical to have that full spectrum for that entourage and synergistic effect because of the unique ways in which each of those elements contribute to a bigger impact.
Yeah, I'm excited for the research that's being done on the individual elements, the individual cannabinoids and so forth. But I also feel like we've went for a very long time and kind of ignored our endocannabinoid system in general. We've kind of deprived our bodies of even having these elements in our body to some extent. And so I really think that I'm 100% with you there as far as the full spectrum. I think it's really the right way to go until we know more about what the individual ones will do. And honestly, I think most products, full spectrum is the way to go for the consumer facing products. I see maybe more value in the individual isolated compounds from unfortunately, I'm going to say a pharmaceutical perspective. I think that's where they'll dial in and patent certain things and try to lock down the market. But as long as we don't allow them to take over the full spectrum and patent that, which is nature itself, I hope they never legally can patent nature itself, but I'm sure they'll try at some point.
Yep.
There's a lot of products out there with CBD in it, and sometimes people maybe have heard of a brand, maybe they haven't heard of a brand. Sometimes they're a little skeptical. What are some of the questions or obstacles that people have in their mind when it comes to using a product like this for the first time in your experience?
Yeah, I think is just use both a combination of common sense and looking at things a little bit more critically, particularly now. When we launched at the end of 2018, and you asked anybody on the street CBD, they would say, what's that? Right. And nowadays, right, the last 18 months, 24 months, it's ubiquitous, right? You get it at a gas station. Well, that should be a telltale that they're profiteers, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's our economy. But again, I think it puts more onus on the individual consumer to do a little bit due diligence, right? To expect a really high quality product for $5.99 at a gas station, come on, that just defies common sense, right? So that's one. And the second is to look more critically. Do they publish tests on their website? Right.
Yes. Ask for the certificate of analysis is what I tell everyone.
That's a great way. And there's reasons for that. I think nowadays, given that, again, there's been so many products, I think a lot of, companies just all of a sudden one day they're in existence because they see an opportunity. Right. And we've seen examples of, CBD isolate in powder form mixed with olive oil and some other things, and just, here you go, right? That's a telltale. I think if you're looking at a company that just, all of a sudden poof, and it looks like it's just a product company without much of a philosophy or formulation, a DNA to it, I think that's another thing to consider in terms of what you're actually probably going to be getting versus a company that, invests in both the quality, first and foremost, of cultivation, of extraction, does the testing, and really has some science behind it rather than just seeking to make a profit short term.
Yeah, I call them gimmick products. There's a lot of them, out there that they'll just have a hot name and they'll, they're just trying to ride the market trend is all they're really doing. Like you said, it's profiteering, nothing wrong with that, but be realistic about what you expect, I think is really, really good advice. As you've gone through this process, obviously in cannabis, it's highly regulated, especially here in California of all places. What have been some of the challenges from a regulatory perspective with, getting a CBD product to market and sourcing that product as well?
Yeah, great question. It's, I thought my legal career and being in the midst of the Fortune 500 on electronic data and criminal investigations was hard. There were elements of this business that have been extremely hard. Facebook and Instagram, just no advertising,
market,
right?
Yeah.
Your credit card processing being shut down. A variety of ways in which there are forces behind the scenes. Right. And I don't want to bitch and complain because all startups have their own challenges. Right. But these were unique and they persist. Right. And I think with some good reason. Right. From a sort of public policy and public health perspective, like, there's reasons behind why I think there were a skepticism and due caution around something that can be very habit forming. Right. THC, there's no question it can become habit forming. And at the same time, the extent to which these forces behind the scenes have gone to try to lock down and sort of downplay and diminish has been very frustrating. Both as a business owner and a founder and startup, things like credit card processing and not being able to advertise and talk about things that can really benefit people. That's probably been the most frustrating thing. And, I get why that is, that there are forces behind the scenes that really don't want to see a bunch of cannabinoids out there helping people heal naturally and, improve their health, right? Because that flies in the face of, right, economic forces that are otherwise benefiting from not having that and having other means, in particular in our culture, drugs, right? So that's been a frustration. But also look at the proliferation of hemp products and CBD. It's everywhere out there, even in spite of those hurdles and challenges that have been put up. Listen, it works. There's a reason that people want it, both here in the US, and you look globally. Let's take the UK, for example. They started an experiment, I think 3 years ago, where you could register to gain access to CBD. Well, the registrations just started to go through the roof within a 12 to 18 month period. And you're seeing other countries, Brazil, import a lot of hemp. And it's the government doing this because they know it lowers healthcare costs. And so that to me is encouraging, that both to your point, that the science is still emerging, even though there's a lot of science showing how beneficial cannabinoids are, right? But I think we're just honestly just starting, and that holds so much promise, not just for cannabis, but for other alternative, much more sustainable, herbal-based and homeopathic, naturopathic means that can really help address some of the most significant health crises that we struggle with today.
Yeah, it's what is it they say? It's more profitable to treat the disease than to ever cure it, or whatever the ailment may be. I think seems to be a possible trend in our healthcare system setup, at least the way it sort of is.
Yeah, and I think whether you're in this country, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, like, is that the way you want to go? Like, you just want to be fed into a sick care system. And I think so much of the country can benefit from saying, hey, hang on a second here. Look at the numbers. Look at what is happening. And COVID's one example. Now, leave aside, people can argue with, oh, they're overcounting the numbers. It's all a bunch of, no. The reality is a lot of people lost their lives and loved ones that are lost because we've got these health conditions that make us much more susceptible. and less resilient. And so I think we need to take it upon ourselves to look at what we can do individually.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartly. When it comes to this education, because there seems to be, a lack of understanding, whether it is expressing the need for healthier eating habits or more activity, or, more specifically to cannabis and CBD, just, educating the public, the general public, about what this is and kind of changing some of the misconceptions about it, because I know it's something that I deal with a lot. I talk to government officials, I talk to the general public, and it still in 2022 shocks me at how many people have the reefer madness sort of rhetoric around CBD, THC, and these other derivative products. In your opinion, or from your perspective, what can we do as either, to educate people better on all these facets about not just the products, but living a healthier lifestyle? Does that have to, like you said, I think you touched on it earlier a little bit, that the answer is not going to come from the government, but I'll throw it out there as an option. Does the government need to come in and say, hey, we need to do a statewide or a nationwide education on this? Or does it come from companies and operators that maybe need to take that leadership role as leaders in that industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a vexing one, right? Because there's a lot of variables and parties that have different perspectives, right? And yet, I think the combination of certainly the government raising more awareness, right, and taking health much more seriously beyond just sick care, right, to really create thriving communities, and certainly with young adults, that is the next generation. And I think certain administrations, have done a better job than others at that. But also, I think, companies and communities in certain ways can reinforce the importance of movement and eating whole food, and being very careful and cautious around just, the next thing that's in a box that promises to be, the fast track to nirvana. I think we all need to pay attention to that and recognize that, whole foods grown out of the ground, right, are likely far better than something that's manufactured in a factory, as our staple, right, of how we're getting our nutrition. And I think there is increased awareness. Now, I think there are other economic forces at play in terms of, there are these food deserts, and we know they exist both in our cities and out in rural areas where, convenience stores can't be the source of the primary means of nutrition for so many people, right? And I think that does, take some government involvement. And honestly, as much as people love to lambast lawyers, there are lawyers that do very good work taking to task both drug and food companies that are not supporting long-term health. And so, yeah, it's multifaceted, but I think just the awareness, conversations like this, journalists who dig into this area go a long way. And I think, that's why you see the proliferation of CBD and things like turmeric and other things that years ago, no one even knew what you were talking about. And now people very much do know. And then I think it's supporting people with the practices that break the habits, because as we talked about earlier, right, and you pointed out, if you've been feeding your gut sugar, carbs, all this crappy stuff, guess what you're going to want more of? That's just the way the gut is. So breaking these, I think we can help people with some practices and habits, some of which we've talked about here, to do just that. And for us at PurePower, it is, we say this explicitly on our website, this is not about pushing pills. Like to think some, popping pills, even vitamins, is like the way to, get healthy. No, it's part of a lifestyle.
Yeah, it's reminds me of when I was a kid. I was, I wasn't overweight by any means, but I never had a six pack. And I always remember having these super skinny friends that just had these ripped abs. And I was like, man, one day, and I had an older gentleman. He was like, if you want those things, there's no substitute for the hard work and the discipline of going to the gym, exercising, running, and eating right. He's like, there's just no substitute. They can promise you that it'll happen if you take a weight loss pill or whatever, but it's not going to get you there. And if it does, you're not going to be able to maintain it. So there's no substitution for that for certain.
Yeah. And to celebrate it, honestly, right. That sort of movement, I think, in our families and our communities to celebrate, right. And that's where I think athletics, even if you're not playing an organized sport, but just movement can be such a vehicle for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Lastly, before I want to be, respectful of your time. So we'll start as we're starting to wind down here a little bit. You touched earlier on some of the challenges around marketing. How do you can you kind of delve into that a little bit, into more detail? I mean, I'm pretty familiar with them, but for some of the listeners, how do those challenges, because I've talked about how it is from the cannabis standpoint, it's very similar to the CBD standpoint as well. How do you manage to sort of stand out from the crowd? Because unlike for us, we can only market and sell in the state in which we operate, as where hemp-derived CBD is technically it's available throughout the nation. How does that sort of differentiate from a marketing and advertising standpoint?
Yeah, great question. I think what we've discovered is that, paid advertising just doesn't work in the way that, most other products are able to, right? Namely the major social media platforms. And so therefore you're left with looking at alternative ways to make people aware. And so that looks like, blog posts that get reposted, right? Education-based marketing in so many ways, I think is far superior to just straight, putting banner ads and just that sort. While that works, I think this requires more education and more awareness for the very reasons that you've touched on, right? That there's been just a cultural, paradigm shift around hemp and cannabis generally. And so education-based is I feel like the most valuable thing. And then also for us, it's showing up where at events and in places where we know that there are likely to be people that are open to alternative methods of improving their health and elevating their performance. So that's been another big one. Podcasts just like this have been instrumental for us. And, and we wrote a book, we published it, hit bestseller status in a couple of categories on Amazon. That's been another means of just getting the word out there in a way that, we're not so heavily focused on, promoting the products, but instead just elevating awareness and educating and then allowing people to make informed decisions. Back to your question earlier, how does one make decisions? Well, I think, again, looking at what's behind the products, right? And what's the message and the mission beyond just slapping a label on a product and making a couple bucks.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. So what's next on the horizon for yourself? Do you have any races planned, or is there a new product coming out anytime soon? Anything new coming up?
Great question, Matthew. I appreciate that. So, every year for me in the summer, it's, thinking about what events, and I'll be 53 in September. So working up toward a big effort in the San Juans outside Telluride, Colorado in late August. I've run in that area before, and that'll be a great challenge for me. And likely going to mix in an Xterra mountain triathlon. I did my first one last year outside of Beaver Creek in the Vail Valley, and I really enjoyed that.
Now, what's the difference between those two?
So the Xterra Mountain Triathlon is it's a combination of swimming, open water swimming, mountain biking, and running.
I see.
And I love that just mix, even though last year was the first time I swam a mile in open water, and it was a good experience. I just set myself in the back and just got out last. So that's on the horizon for me. And then product-wise, we've just released a new topical, a 2,000 milligram Reboot relief stick that we're very, very excited about the way it goes on and the impact it has. So we'll be doing right now we have a cooling version of that, and we'll be looking at a warming version of that as well. And then we're constantly iterating, not unlike a company that I admire very much, Athletic Greens. They've upgraded their formula dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and we're doing the same. So we're on we'll be going into our third iteration of the products. So Power Up, our energy product, we added some NAD precursors, given their significant tie to energy and endurance and supporting mitochondrial function. And our sleep product, we're in the middle of upgrading the sleep product as well to really dial that in. So you get, just such deep sleep, but you wake up ready to go rather than a melatonin hangover feeling like you got hit over the head. So it's just dialing things in based on our customer feedback.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about melatonin. I think I was reading somewhere, because melatonin is so popular right now in a variety of sleep products, but I was reading somewhere that if you take it on a consistent basis, it sort of affects your own ability to produce your own melatonin. So it might not be the best thing to actually take every night.
Yeah, it's like SSRIs, right? In the short term, they did help me in dark moments, but long term, you're asking for trouble. And that's exactly what I experienced. So I think that's one thing that we've never had melatonin. We will never have melatonin. Not to say on a very limited basis it can't be beneficial, but I think long term it has some risks of not serving us so well long term.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I agree. Well, before we go, tell everybody where they can follow you or and find your products online.
Great. So PurePower can be found on social at PurePower Life, and our website is livepurepower.com, www.livepurepower.com. And Matthew, love to extend for your listeners, use PurePower 15 for 15% off your first purchase at livepurepower.com. And again, PurePower Life on social. And then I'm on social at Don McLaughlin Jr. On the socials, and that's the best way to connect with us. And there's an opportunity on our website to get a free copy of that best-selling book that I mentioned. So that's at livepurepower.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I always enjoy chatting with people who have done some incredible things and are, out there trying to, change people's perception and have open dialogue. I think that's really what it's about. Just being able to disagree on some things, agree on other things, and just, realize that we're all just people in this floating around on this rock in the middle of the universe.
Your podcast and this discussion goes a long way in doing just that, Matthew. So I appreciate that and appreciate the conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you for joining another episode of The Evolved Idiots. And until next time, peace and love to the people of the planet Earth.